The rain had stopped an hour before, but the cold stayed behind, seeping through the cracked pavement of Larimer Square like something that refused to leave. Denver at dusk wore its lights well. Strings of gold bulbs looped between brick buildings, the smell of roasted coffee drifting from a corner café, laughter spilling out of a rooftop bar, 3 stories up. It was the kind of evening built for people who had somewhere warm to go home to. Owen Hale was not one of those people. Not tonight. He sat with his back pressed against the cold brick wall of an old warehouse, knees drawn up to his chest. A threadbare army surplus jacket pulled tight around a frame that looked far thinner than it should. His boots were split at the seams. His hands wrapped loosely around a paper cup that held exactly $4.37 in change, trembled not entirely from the cold. 3 weeks of sleeping in doorways and behind dumpsters had carved hollows beneath his eyes. His beard had grown in patchy and unkempt, his hair matted beneath a wool cap someone had thrown away outside a thrift store. To anyone walking past, he was simply another face the city had learned to look through. He watched the people pass, watched them not watch him. Then came the voices. Oh my God, Danielle, look, is that? No way. 2 women had stopped mid-stride on the sidewalk across from him, phones already rising, already recording. One of them tall, sharp-jawed, wrapped in a cream wool coat that probably cost more than Owen had spent on food in the last month, took a step closer, tilting her head like she was examining something in a museum case. Owen Hale, she said, drawing the name out, savoring it. Denver's own golden boy, homecoming king, voted most likely to own the world. Remember that Danielle's senior yearbook? The second woman, Danielle, let out a short, ugly laugh. Guess the world got tired of him first. Owen's stomach folded in on itself. He knew that voice. Rachel Doyle. They had sat 2 rows apart in Mr. Pruitt's economics class 15 years ago, back when his father was still alive, back when the Hale name meant a modest brewery in Golden and a man who worked 18-hour days to keep the lights on. Rachel used to borrow his notes. Rachel used to call him sweet. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. Rachel did not look at him like he was sweet now. Say something, she said, crouching slightly phone-angled to catch his face in the streetlight. Come on. Say something for the camera. Where's all that charm now, Owen? Where's the guy who used to strut around like he was going to buy the whole city someday? He said nothing. His jaw tightened. He kept his eyes on the paper cup. He's not even going to answer us, Danielle said, delighted like she'd found the punchline of a joke she'd been building for years. Look at him. Doesn't even have the dignity to be embarrassed. Maybe he can't talk, Rachel said, voice dripping with mock pity. Maybe the great Owen Hale finally ran out of things to say once he ran out of money to say them with. A small crowd had begun to gather the way. Crowds do not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the low magnetic pull of a spectacle. A man in a Broncos hoodie chuckled and shook his head. A teenage boy filmed for a few seconds before losing interest and wandering off. Someone muttered. Sad the way people say it about weather, about traffic, about anything that costs them nothing to feel. Rachel crouched lower, closing the distance close enough that Owen could smell her perfume vanilla and something expensive cutting through the smell of wet concrete and old garbage. Do you remember what you said to me at graduation? She asked, quieter, now almost intimate, which somehow made it worse. You said someday you'd build something so big nobody in this city would ever be able to look away from it. She straightened, glancing back at Danielle with a smirk. Well, you were right about one thing. Nobody can look away. Laughter. Sharp, bright, careless laughter, the kind that used to fill hallways and cafeterias, now aimed downward like a spotlight with nowhere else to go. Something in Owen's chest twisted, not anger, not exactly. Something closer to grief. He thought of his father, Walter Hale, standing behind the bar of that first small brewhouse in golden sleeves, rolled up hands stained with hops and sweat, telling a 9-year-old Owen that a man's worth was never something you could read off a price tag. He thought of nights after his father died, nights when there had been no money for the heating bill, when he had worn every sweater he owned to bed and still shivered until morning. He had believed back then that if he ever climbed out of that cold, he would never let anyone talk to another human being the way people were talking to him now. He did not move. He did not flinch. He simply lowered his eyes to the cracked pavement between his boots and let the words fall over him like the rain had an hour before, cold, relentless, and impossible to stop. A block away, inside a black Range Rover idling at the curb with its headlights off, Sam Whitfield sat gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles had gone pale. On the dashboard, a small, discreet camera fed a live image to the phone propped against the windshield. Owen hunched against the brick wall, two women circling him like he was something to be photographed rather than someone to be spoken to. "This is insane," Sam muttered to himself, jaw clenched. He reached for his phone and typed quickly, "You don't have to do this. Say the word and I'm out there right now." He watched the three dots appear on the screen. Disappear. Appear again. Finally, a reply came through, slow and deliberate, the way Owen always wrote when he meant something completely. "I have to see it for myself, Sam. All of it. Even the parts that hurt." Sam exhaled long and unsteady and set the phone back down. 12 years he had known this man since they were 17-year-old kids, working weekend shifts at the brewery for $5 an hour, since the funeral where Owen had stood alone at the edge of the crowd because there hadn't been anyone left to stand beside him. Sam had watched Owen build an empire out of nothing but stubbornness and a memory of his father's hands. He had never once seen Owen back down from anything. That was exactly what terrified him now. Out on the sidewalk, Rachel finally lowered her phone, apparently satisfied, already scrolling through the footage with a self-satisfied little smile. "This is going up tonight," she said to Danielle, not bothering to lower her voice. "People are going to lose their minds." "Wait," Danielle said, suddenly squinting down at Owen with the first flicker of uncertainty crossing her face. "That's actually kind of messed up, don't you think? Like, what if something really happened to him?" Rachel waved a manicured hand, already turning to leave. "Please. Guys like Owen Hale don't actually fall this far. He's probably just doing some weird midlife stunt. Attention-seeking." She glanced back over her shoulder one last time, and for a fraction of a second so brief it might have been imagined, something almost like doubt passed behind her eyes. Then it was gone, buried beneath the practiced boredom of someone who had already decided what kind of story this was going to be. The two women disappeared into the golden light of the wine bar down the block, their laughter trailing behind them like smoke. Owen remained where he was for a long moment after they left, staring at nothing, listening to his own heartbeat slow from a frantic drumbeat back into something almost human. Above him, a street lamp flickered once, twice, then steadied. Somewhere down the block, a bus hissed to a stop and pulled away again. The city kept moving indifferent the way it always did. He thought about standing. Thought about walking 2 blocks to where Sam was waiting, climbing into the warm car, letting all of this end tonight. Instead, he pulled his jacket tighter around his shoulders, tucked his chin against his chest, and stayed exactly where he was. Because somewhere in this city, he told himself, somewhere among 800,000 strangers who would never know his name until it was too late to matter, there had to be one person left who could look at a man with nothing and still choose to be kind. He was not ready to stop looking. Not yet. The Range Rover eased away from the curb without its headlights, gliding 2 blocks north before turning down a narrow alley behind a shuttered bookstore where the noise of Larimer Square faded into a hush broken only by the low hum of the engine. Sam Whitfield killed the ignition but didn't get out right away. He sat there, hands still resting on the wheel, watching Owen Hale walk toward the car in the side mirror, shoulders hunched, steps slower than they should have been for a man who, 3 weeks ago, could have crossed that same alley in a $2,000 coat without a single person looking twice. The passenger door opened. Owen climbed in, and the smell of the street came with him, wet wool exhaust, something colder underneath that Sam couldn't quite name. For a moment, neither man spoke. The heater ticked as it kicked on, and warm air began slowly to fill the small space between them. "You heard all of it," Owen said finally. It wasn't a question. Every word. Sam's voice was tight, controlled in the particular way of a man forcing himself not to raise it. "Rachel Doyle Owen. You used to help her cheat on economics tests. I remember. And she just knelt down and filmed you like you were a car accident." Sam turned in his seat, and in the dim light his face looked older than his 34 years, carved through with something between anger and fear. "I watched a woman who once asked you to prom stand 3 feet away and call you pathetic, and you just sat there and took it." Owen leaned his head back against the seat, closing his eyes. "I know what it looked like." "Then tell me why you're doing this to yourself, because I have been asking you that question for 3 weeks and I still don't have an answer that makes any sense." Sam's hands tightened briefly on the wheel before releasing. "You're the founder and chairman of Hale Brewing Company. You built something worth more than 9 figures out of a single tap room your father started with a used kettle and a prayer. You could be sleeping in the Brown Palace penthouse tonight. Instead, you're sleeping behind a dumpster on Wasey Street letting strangers spit insults at you for a camera, and I am supposed to just sit in this car and watch it happen." Owen was quiet for a long moment. Outside, a delivery truck rumbled past the mouth of the alley, its headlights sweeping briefly across the windshield and gone again. "Do you remember my father's funeral?" Owen asked. Sam's jaw shifted. "Of course I remember. 200 people came, Sam. 200. Half of them I'd never met in my life. Distributors, investors, men in suits who shook my hand and told me what a visionary my father was, how the company was in good hands, how they looked forward to continuing the relationship." Owen's voice stayed low even, but something underneath it had gone brittle. "Not one of them asked if I was okay. Not one of them looked at 17-year-old me standing next to a casket and saw a kid who'd just lost the only family he had left. They saw a name on a brewery label. They saw an opportunity standing very still in a black suit." Sam said nothing. He had been there. He remembered standing beside Owen at the edge of that crowd, remembered how the wind had cut through both their thin jackets, remembered that no one, not one of those 200 people, had thought to offer either of them a coat. It's been that way ever since Owen went on. Every handshake, every dinner, every woman who's ever smiled at me across a table, I used to be able to tell myself I didn't care whether it was real, that it didn't matter, that a man builds an empire and accepts that empires are lonely. He opened his eyes and looked at Sam directly. "But it started to matter, Sam. Somewhere in the last year it started to matter more than anything else I own. So you decided the answer was to become homeless. I decided the answer was to become invisible." Owen's voice sharpened not with anger at Sam, but with the exhaustion of a man who had turned the same thought over in his mind 1,000 times before finally saying it out loud. "If I strip away the name, the company, the money, everything that makes people perform kindness instead of feel it, what's left? Is there a single person in this city who would still choose to be good to me, when being good to me costs them something and gets them nothing back?" He shook his head slowly. "I needed to know the answer to that question before I stood on a stage again and let another crowd of strangers applaud a man they don't actually know." Sam exhaled some of the tension, leaving his shoulders replaced by something closer to sorrow. "That's what this is about. Golden Wren." Owen nodded. Golden Wren, the 10th anniversary, released the beer his father had spent the last 2 years of his life quietly perfecting before the heart attack took him in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, standing at the very kettle where it had all begun. It had taken Owen a decade to finish his father's recipe, to get the balance of hops and honey exactly right, to feel like the beer actually deserved the old man's name stamped across the label. The company had planned the launch for months, press distributors, a room full of people who would raise a glass and call it a triumph. 9 days, Sam said quietly. 9 days, Owen agreed. And then I put the suit back on and I stand in front of every camera in Colorado and I become Owen Hale chairman again. He looked down at his own hands. Hands that 3 weeks ago had been soft from boardrooms and now bore the raw, reddened evidence of nights spent gripping a paper cup for warmth. I just need to know before that happens that somewhere out there in this city there's proof that people can still be kind without an angle. I need to find her or him, whoever it turns out to be, before I go back to being someone everyone already has an opinion about. Sam studied him for a long moment, the anger slowly draining out of his face and leaving behind something raw. He had known Owen Hale since they were 17-year-old boys stacking kegs for $5 an hour in a brewery that smelled like burnt hops and hope. He had watched this man bury his father with nothing but a borrowed black tie, and an empty bank account had watched him claw his way year after year into becoming one of the wealthiest self-made men in the state, and he had never, not once in 17 years, seen him look this tired. "Okay," Sam said finally quietly. "Okay, but I'm not disappearing. I'm going to be within 2 blocks of you every single night, whether you like it or not. And if anything happens to you out there, I am calling this whole thing off myself, chairman's orders or not." A faint, exhausted smile tugged at the corner of Owen's mouth, the first hint of warmth Sam had seen on his face in 3 weeks. "Deal. And you need to eat something that isn't a gas station hot dog." Sam reached into the back seat and produced a paper bag, setting it on Owen's lap without ceremony. Inside was a turkey sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water. "Don't argue with me. I watched you flinch putting weight on your left foot getting into this car. You've lost, 15 pounds? 18, Owen admitted quietly, and something about saying the number out loud made it feel more real than it had felt in the mirror of a gas station bathroom that morning, staring at the hollow of his own collarbone. Sam's expression darkened again, but he didn't push. He simply reached over and gripped Owen's shoulder once briefly, the way he used to when they were teenagers, and one of them needed to know the other wasn't going anywhere. 9 days, he said again. "Find your proof, Owen, and then come home." Owen looked out the window toward the mouth of the alley, where the lights of the city glittered on indifferent and endless hiding somewhere within them. He had to believe one honest heart he hadn't found yet. "I will," he said. "One way or another, I will." The engine started again, low and steady, and the car pulled forward into the wet, glowing streets of Denver, carrying a billionaire dressed as a beggar back out into the cold to keep searching for the one thing his money had never been able to buy. Morning came to Denver, the way it always did in early autumn, pale gold light, sliding low across the Front Range, the air sharp enough to bite through even a heavy coat. Owen Hale had spent the night in the doorway of a shuttered hardware store 2 blocks from Colfax Avenue, and by the time the sky began to lighten, his whole body ached with a cold that had settled somewhere deep in his bones. His stomach had stopped growling hours ago. It had simply gone quiet, the way hunger does when it stops asking and starts insisting. He walked without any real destination, following the smell of frying batter and coffee that drifted from a small diner on the corner of 13th and Pearl, a squat brick building with a hand-painted sign that read Callahan's Inn, faded red letters, a string of small American flags taped along the inside of the window, and a bell above the door that jingled cheerfully every time it opened, as though it hadn't yet learned that not every day deserved cheerfulness. Owen stood outside for a long moment, hands shoved deep into his jacket pockets, watching through the fogged glass as a waitress moved between tables with a coffee pot in one hand and a notepad in the other. She was maybe 25, 26, dressed in a faded green apron over a flannel shirt, her copper-brown hair pulled back in a loose braid that had mostly come undone by mid-morning. She laughed at something. An elderly man at the counter said, refilled his cup without being asked, and moved on before he could even finish thanking her. Owen did not go in. He had learned over 3 weeks exactly how far he was welcome in places like this, which was to say not at all. He turned instead toward the alley beside the building where a green dumpster sat half in shadow, and where, if he was fortunate, breakfast might still be salvageable from whatever the diner had thrown out that morning. He did not make it 3 steps. "Hey." The voice was warm, unhurried, and it stopped him cold, not because it was unkind, but because it wasn't. Owen turned slowly, bracing himself the way he had learned to brace himself for whatever came next. The waitress stood in the diner's side doorway, one hand still holding it open, the morning light catching the loose strands of hair around her face. She wasn't looking at him the way Rachel Doyle had looked at him 3 nights ago, not like a spectacle, not like a photo opportunity. She was simply looking at him the way a person looks at another person. "You can't eat out of that," she said, nodding toward the dumpster. "Health code sealed it shut last month. Come on in instead." Owen's throat tightened. "I don't have any money," he said, and the words came out rougher than he intended, edged with the particular shame of a man who had spent a decade signing checks with more zeros than most people saw in a lifetime, and who now had to say those 5 words out loud to a stranger. "I didn't ask if you had money." She held the door wider. "I asked if you wanted breakfast. Come sit at the counter. Nobody's going to bother you." He hesitated. Every instinct built over 3 weeks on the street told him this was the setup for something. A joke, a photograph, a punchline he wouldn't be able to see coming until it landed. But something in her face made the hesitation feel foolish, and after a moment he found himself walking past her into the warm, bacon-scented air of the diner. She led him to a stool at the far end of the counter away from the window, and set a mug down in front of him without a word, filling it with coffee so hot that steam curled up off the surface. "Cream's there if you want it," she said, nodding toward a small metal pitcher, and then disappeared into the kitchen before he could find the words to thank her. Owen wrapped both hands around the mug and simply held it for a moment, letting the warmth seep into fingers that had gone stiff sometime around 3 that morning. Around him, the diner hummed with ordinary sound, a cook calling out an order, the clatter of a plate, an old radio somewhere, playing a country station low enough to be background noise. Nobody stared. Nobody reached for a phone. For the first time in 3 weeks, Owen Hale simply existed in a room without being a curiosity. The waitress returned a few minutes later, with a plate, scrambled eggs, a stack of pancakes, 2 strips of bacon, more food than Owen had eaten in a single sitting since this had all begun. He looked up at her, startled. "I really don't have any way to pay you back," he said quietly. "I didn't ask you to." She leaned one hip against the counter, studying him with a directness that wasn't unkind, just honest. "You look like you haven't eaten in days." Something like that. "Then eat," she said simply, and turned to refill the elderly man's coffee, 3 stools down. He ate slowly at first, and then with an urgency he was almost embarrassed by, and when he finally set his fork down, she had come back to lean against the counter across from him again, arms folded, watching him with the same open curiosity, though not the invasive kind. "I'm Ruby," she said. Ruby Callahan. This place was my dad's. Was. Something flickered across her face. Brief practice, the particular grief of a person who has learned to answer this question 100 times without letting it undo her. He passed a year and a half ago. Heart gave out one morning right behind that grill. She nodded toward the kitchen. I took it over. Wasn't really a choice exactly. It's what you do when it's the only thing left of somebody. I'm sorry, Owen said, and meant it more than the words could carry. Ruby shrugged, though her eyes had gone somewhere distant for a moment. He used to say the strangest things, my dad. Things that didn't make a lot of sense until years later. She reached for the coffee pot again, turning it slowly in her hands rather than pouring like she needed something to do with her fingers while she talked. He always told me when you see somebody who's fallen down, you give them your hand first. You ask questions later if you ask them at all. He said the world's already got enough people standing around calculating whether somebody deserves help before they'll lift a finger. Said the ones who don't calculate, those are the only ones worth being. Owen went very still. The words landed somewhere in his chest he hadn't expected, striking a nerve so deep and so old he couldn't immediately place its source, only that it felt impossibly familiar. A memory stirred at the very edge of him, blurred and half-formed like a photograph left too long in the sun. The smell of frying onions late at night. A kind voice telling a hungry, frightened teenage boy to sit down and eat. Worry about the money. Just eat. And then the memory slipped away again before he could hold on to it, dissolving back into the general ache of exhaustion. That's a good way to live, Owen said finally, his voice unsteady in a way he hoped she wouldn't notice. It's a hard way to live, Ruby corrected, gently setting the coffee pot down. Doesn't pay great. This place barely breaks, even most months. But I figure if I stop doing it his way, then he's really gone. Like all the way gone. And I'm not ready for that. She looked at him for a moment longer, something thoughtful crossing her face. What's your name? Owen, he said. And something about giving even that much, just the first name, no company, no title, no history, felt like setting down a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying differently these past 3 weeks. Here in this small, warm room, he was not Owen Hale, chairman of Hale Brewing Company. He was simply Owen, a hungry man who had been given breakfast by a woman who asked nothing in return. Well, Owen, Ruby said, you're welcome back here anytime. Morning shift's usually me, and I'm not real good at watching people go hungry 2 doors down from a working kitchen. She glanced toward the window, toward the gray light strengthening over the street. Rent's due Friday, and I still don't know how I'm covering it, so it's not like I've got money to throw around. But there's always eggs. There's always coffee. Across the street in a car parked just close enough to see through the diner's fogged window, but far enough to remain unnoticed, Sam Whitfield lowered a pair of binoculars, slowly, his brow furrowed. Not with suspicion, exactly not yet, but with the particular alertness of a man who had learned, through long friendship, to watch closely for anything that might hurt someone he loved. He pulled out his phone and opened a blank note. Ruby Callahan, he typed. Callahan's Diner, 13th and Pearl. Father deceased 18 months ago. Need everything on her family finances, anything. He stared at the message for a long moment before hitting send, some old instinct telling him this was only the beginning of something far larger than a woman pouring coffee for a stranger, though even Sam, sharp as he was, could not yet have guessed how far back the story actually went or how close to home the truth was about to land. 3 days passed before Sam Whitfield came back with anything, and when he did, he didn't call. He drove straight to the penthouse suite. Owen still technically owned above the Hale Brewing Company headquarters, the one Owen hadn't slept in for nearly a month, and let himself in with his own key, a thin manila folder tucked on one arm and an expression on his face that made the doorman downstairs step back without being asked to. He found Owen in the bathroom off the guest suite, the one place in the building with a shower. Owen still allowed himself twice a week standing in front of the mirror in a plain white undershirt, staring at his own reflection with the particular exhaustion of a man who no longer quite recognized what he saw there. The hollows under his eyes had deepened. His collarbones pressed sharp against thin cotton. You need to sit down, Sam said from the doorway. Owen turned, and something in Sam's voice, a tightness, a tremor he had never once heard from his oldest friend in 17 years, made him do exactly that. Lowering himself onto the closed toilet lid like his legs had simply decided the conversation ahead required it. Sam didn't sit. He stood in the doorway holding the folder against his chest like it might try to escape him, and for a long moment he just looked at Owen, searching his face for something Owen couldn't name. I ran the standard background check, Sam said finally. Ruby Callahan, 26 years old. Only child. Father Franklin Callahan, everybody called him Frank, ran that diner for almost 30 years before he passed. Mother's out of the picture, left when Ruby was a kid. No debts on Ruby's name beyond the diner's mortgage, no red flags, nothing that should worry you. He paused. That's not why I'm here, Sam. Owen's voice had gone very quiet. What is it? Sam opened the folder and pulled out a single sheet, an old photograph printed from a digitized newspaper archive, grainy but unmistakable. He held it out with a hand that wasn't entirely steady. I was trying to verify the diner's ownership history, Sam said. Standard due diligence. And I found this in a feature the Denver Post ran 15 years ago, some human interest piece on small businesses in the 5 Points area. There's a caption. He swallowed. Read the caption, Owen. Owen took the photograph. It showed the same diner, younger, brighter the paint on the sign, not yet faded, with a broad-shouldered man in a white apron standing in the doorway, one arm slung around a girl of maybe 11 who had to be Ruby, both of them laughing at something outside the frame. Behind them, barely visible through the window, a boy sat alone at the counter, head down over a plate, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. Owen's whole body went still. He knew that coat. He remembered the exact weight of it, the way the sleeves had to be rolled twice to free his hands, the smell of mothballs from whatever donation bin it had come from. He remembered with a clarity that struck like something physical, sitting at a counter very much like that one night after night, for the better part of a year, while a broad-shouldered man with kind eyes set down a plate in front of him and said the same 6 words every single time: eat first. We'll talk later. That's me, Owen said, and his voice came out cracked barely above a whisper. Sam. That's me in that photograph. I know, Sam said. I recognized the coat before I recognized you. You wore that thing every day for almost a year back when he stopped himself, but both of them knew exactly what year, exactly what winter, exactly whose house Owen had run from at 16 years old with nothing but that coat and the clothes. Underneath it, I called the paper, got the photographer's original notes. Owen, the caption. Read the caption. Owen looked down at the small block of text printed beneath the image. Frank Callahan, longtime owner of Callahan's Diner, has quietly fed dozens of hungry teenagers off the books over the years, asking nothing in return, including one regular customer pictured here who came in most nights for nearly a year, during a difficult period in his young life. The paper fell from Owen's hands. Every hollow, humiliating memory of that year came rushing back at once. The shame of walking into that diner for the first time, 16 years old, having slept 3 nights in a row behind the hardware store, 2 blocks over, certain someone would throw him out the moment they saw him. Instead, a man had simply set a plate down in front of him without a word about payment, without a single question about why a teenage boy was alone and starving on a Tuesday night. Night after night, that same silent kindness. Never once had Owen learned the man's full name. He had only ever called him Chief, the way half the neighborhood did. And one bitter February morning, the diner had simply stopped being safe to visit after Owen's stepfather tracked him to a shelter 3 blocks away, and the whole fragile routine collapsed along with everything else in his life. He had never gone back. He had told himself in the 15 years since that it was because he'd been too ashamed. The truth he understood now, sitting on the edge of a bathtub in a penthouse worth more than the entire block that diner sat on, was that he had simply never let himself remember clearly enough to go looking. Frank Callahan. Owen repeated, testing the name like it might dissolve if he said it too roughly. Ruby's father. He's the one who... His voice broke entirely, and he pressed the heel of his hand hard against his eyes, breathing through something that felt less like grief and more like a door being torn open after 15 years bolted shut. Sam, I owe that man everything. I owe him my life, and I never even knew his name until right now, and he's already gone. I can't even... He stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Sam crouched down in front of him, setting a hand on his shoulder the way he had in the car 3 weeks before. There's more, he said gently, and something in his tone made Owen lift his head. There's more. The diner's mortgage. Sam pulled a second document from the folder. I told you it was current, and it is, but it shouldn't be as high as it is for a building that size. I dug into the original loan history. 11 years ago, Frank Callahan refinanced through a predatory balloon payment structure, the kind that looks manageable for a few years and then detonates all at once. The original lender that pushed it on him was a shell company. Sam's jaw tightened. Registered under Vance Holdings. Same family that owns Vance Development. Same family whose son has been sniffing around Ruby for the better part of 2 months. Owen went very still, something cold settling underneath the grief. You're telling me the Vances trapped Frank Callahan in a loan that nearly cost him his diner? The same man who fed me for free every night for a year, when I had nothing. I'm telling you it looks that way, and I'm going to keep digging until I know for certain, Sam said. But Owen, I need you to hear what I'm actually saying underneath all of it. The woman who's been feeding you breakfast for free this past week. The one whose kindness you've been trying to figure out if it's real or not. He shook his head slowly, something almost like awe breaking through the exhaustion on his face. She learned it from her father, and her father spent it on you before either of you ever knew each other's names. Owen sat in silence for a long moment, the photograph still lying face up on the tile floor between them. A broad-shouldered man in a white apron, a laughing girl who would grow up to pour coffee for a stranger without asking a single question, and a hungry boy in an oversized coat who had never once said thank you because he had never had the chance. I have to go back there, Owen said, finally, his voice raw. Not as Owen the beggar. Not yet. Just I have to sit at that counter again and understand what I'm looking at. You will, Sam said. But Owen. He hesitated, choosing his next words carefully. If this is true, if the Vances really did engineer that loan to squeeze a struggling widower with a young daughter, and now Preston Vance is circling that same daughter 15 years later, with a diamond and a fake fortune, his voice hardened, then this isn't just about you finding proof that kindness is real. This is about something a lot bigger and a lot uglier, and I don't think either one of us understands yet how deep it goes. Outside the window, Denver's late afternoon light had turned the color of honey spilling gold across the mountains in the distance. The same light, Owen thought numbly, that must have filled that diner window every evening 15 years ago while a kind man fed a broken boy and asked for nothing, never imagining how far the debt would one day travel to be repaid. Night settled over Denver slowly that evening, the kind of clear autumn dark that let every star show itself above the skyline, and Owen Hale had not moved from the guest suite in nearly 3 hours. The photograph still lay on the low table in front of him next to a mug of coffee that had long since gone cold. Sam sat across from him in the room's single armchair, not speaking, not checking his phone, simply present in the way he had learned to be present for Owen since they were 17 years old. A kind of silent watch ready to catch whatever came next. It was Owen who finally broke the silence. I need to tell you something, he said. Something I've never told anyone. Not my board. Not the 2 women I dated seriously enough to consider marrying. Not even you, and you've known me longer than anyone alive. Sam straightened slightly in the chair but said nothing, giving Owen the space to find his way into it. Owen reached into the inside pocket of the jacket draped over the back of the couch, not the ragged one he wore on the street, but an older one worn soft at the elbows that he kept folded at the bottom of a drawer. No one else ever opened. From it, he withdrew a small object wrapped in a handkerchief, and when he unfolded the cloth, a thin silver locket caught the lamplight, its surface scratched and dulled with age, the chain long since broken and replaced with a plain length of cord. This belonged to my mother, Owen said. Sam's eyes moved from the locket to Owen's face and back again. In 17 years, he had heard Owen mention his mother exactly twice, both times, in a single clipped sentence, both times followed by a silence, so total that Sam had learned long ago never to ask the question that followed naturally. After, her name was Marianne Owen, went on turning the locket slowly between his fingers. I was 9 years old the last time I saw her. He drew a slow breath, and when he spoke again, his voice had dropped into something flat and careful, the voice of a man reciting a story he had told himself so many times in the dark that the words no longer had sharp edges, only a dull, permanent ache. My father died when I was 7. Heart attack, same as it eventually took me too, 20-some years later. Funny how that works. After that, it was just the 2 of us for a while. My mother and me in a little rental house on Larkspur Road over in Wheat Ridge. And then about a year later, she married a man named Roy Tanner. He paused, and Sam watched something pass behind his friend's eyes, not anger exactly, something older and colder than anger. Roy wasn't a monster in front of other people, Owen continued. That's the thing nobody understands about men like that. In front of neighbors, in front of my teachers, he was charming, generous even. Bought me a bicycle the first Christmas he was around. But behind closed doors, he had a temper that came on like weather. No warning, no pattern you could learn to predict, just sudden and total and terrifying. He never once laid a hand on me. He was too careful for that, too aware of how it would look. Owen's jaw tightened, but he laid his hands on her, constantly, and I used to lie awake in my room down the hall listening to it happen, too young and too small to do anything except lie there and count the seconds between the sounds. Owen, Sam said quietly. You don't have to. I do, Owen cut in gently but firmly. I need to say it out loud for once in my life to someone who actually knows me. He looked down at the locket again. One night I was 9, I woke up to her standing over my bed in the dark, already dressed, already holding my coat. She told me to be very quiet, that we were going on an adventure, that everything was going to be different starting tonight. I remember she was crying but trying very hard to smile at the same time, so I wouldn't be scared. His voice thinned. We got as far as the front porch. The room had gone completely silent except for the low hum of the building's heating system. Roy was already awake, Owen said. He must have heard something, or maybe he just always slept lighter than either of us realized. He came out onto that porch and there was a fight, not like the ones I used to hear through the wall. Loud. Physical. I remember screaming. I remember him shoving her hard and her head hitting the porch railing, and then everything after that is just pieces. Fragments. I remember someone carrying me back inside. I remember waking up the next morning and being told my mother had left, that she'd decided motherhood decided the whole family wasn't something she could handle anymore, and that she'd gone and wasn't coming back, and I needed to accept that and move on and be grateful. Roy was still willing to raise me. And you believed that, Sam said softly. It wasn't a question. I believed it for years, Owen said. What choice did I have? I was 9 years old and the only adult left in the house was the one telling me the story. There was no one to contradict him. No family close enough to ask. My mother's parents were both gone. She had a sister somewhere back east who I met maybe twice in my whole life. So the story just hardened, became fact. My mother left me. My mother decided I wasn't worth staying for. He turned the locket over in his palm, and Sam could see in the lamplight a thin line of engraved script along its edge worn nearly smooth by 15 years of a man's thumb running over the same 6 words over and over like a rosary. She left this behind. I found it years later wedged behind a floorboard in my old room after I'd already left Roy's house for good. It's the only thing of hers I have. He held it out and Sam leaned forward to read the inscription, faint but still legible if you tilted it toward the light just right. Con lun la. No. Sam blinked, and the English letters resolved themselves properly. You will always be. The sentence stopped there, cut off mid-word, the metal simply ending where an engraver's needle had run out of room or been interrupted, or, Sam realized with a slow, cold understanding, perhaps interrupted by something else entirely. It's not finished, Sam said. No, Owen agreed. I used to lie awake trying to guess how it ended. You will always be my son. You will always be loved. You will always be the best thing I ever did. I made up 100 different endings over the years, and none of them ever felt like enough because none of them were real. It was just an unfinished sentence from a woman who apparently couldn't be bothered to finish being my mother. His voice cracked on the last word, and for the first time in 17 years, Sam Whitfield watched his oldest friend's composure break entirely. Watched a man who had built a 9-figure company through sheer force of will sit on the edge of a couch with his shoulders shaking, silent tears sliding down a face that had learned decades ago never to let anyone see this. Sam moved without thinking, crossing the small distance between them, and sitting down beside him, one hand landing firm and steady on Owen's back. Not trying to fix anything, not offering a single word, simply staying. I have spent my entire life, Owen said. When he could speak again, his voice raw and stripped of every polished edge Sam had ever known him to wear in a boardroom, trying to build something so large, so undeniable, that it would somehow prove I was worth staying for. That's what all of this is, Sam. The company. The money. Even this whole insane experiment on the street, looking for someone who'd be kind to me for no reason. He wiped roughly at his face with the back of his hand. I've spent 31 years trying to prove my own mother wrong, and some nights I'm not even sure I believe the proof myself. Sam sat with that for a long moment, letting it settle in the quiet room before he finally spoke. I've known you since we were 17 years old, unloading kegs for $5 an hour, he said. And in 17 years I have never once seen you fail to finish something you started. Not a brewery, not a company, not a friendship. He tightened his grip briefly on Owen's shoulder. I don't know what happened to your mother, Owen. I don't know why that sentence stops where it stops. But I know you. And I don't believe for one second that a woman capable of raising a son, who turned out like you, simply stopped loving him one random Tuesday night for no reason at all. Owen said nothing, but something in his breathing steadied slowly, the way a held breath finally releases after being trapped too long in the chest. Outside the window, the lights of Denver spread out beneath them, indifferent and endless, hiding within them. Not only a woman named Ruby Callahan who fed strangers because her father had taught her to, but though neither man in that room could have guessed it yet, a truth about Marianne Hale that had been buried for 15 years beneath a lie. 2 men had built together to protect a business deal, a truth that would not surface until the very night Owen finally stopped running from every version of the past he had never let himself fully see. The morning after Owen's confession, Ruby Callahan woke before her alarm the way she always did, to the sound of the old radiator ticking to life in the corner of her bedroom, and the pale gray light of a Denver dawn pressing through thin curtains. For a few minutes, she simply lay there staring at the water stain on the ceiling that had been slowly spreading since last spring, thinking not about the diner's mortgage payment due in 4 days, not about the leaking roof over the back storeroom, but about a stranger named Owen who had sat at her counter 3 mornings running now, eating slowly, speaking carefully, watching her with an attention that felt different from the way most men looked at her. She didn't have time to think about it further. Down the narrow hallway of the small rental house she shared with her mother and younger sister, she could already hear Diane Callahan's voice, sharp and quick, carrying through the thin walls. "Ruby Ann, get in this kitchen right now." Ruby closed her eyes briefly, drew a slow breath, and got up. Her mother was standing at the counter when Ruby came in, arms crossed tightly over a faded blue robe, a cup of coffee going cold beside her untouched. Diane Callahan was 53 years old and looked most mornings like a woman who had spent 3 decades bracing for the next disappointment before it arrived. Her hair, once the same copper shade as Ruby's, had gone mostly gray, pulled back severely from a face that had settled over the years into permanent lines of worry. "Sit down," Diane said. "Mom, I have the early shift, I don't have." "Sit down." Ruby sat. Diane set a folded newspaper on the table between them with more force than the gesture required. It was open to the local section, a small photograph tucked near the bottom of the page, grainy, clearly taken from a phone but unmistakable. Ruby recognized the alley behind Larimer Square, recognized with a small drop in her stomach the outline of a man sitting against a brick wall. "Danny Ruiz's wife sent me this," Diane said. "Some social media post that's apparently been going around all week. A homeless man, they say, sitting on the sidewalk downtown, and half the comments are people saying he used to be somebody important, some businessman who lost everything." She tapped the photograph once hard with a chipped fingernail. "And underneath, somebody named Rachel Doyle wrote a whole story about how a waitress downtown has been feeding him for free every morning. Free breakfast, Ruby. At my diner. On my dime. It's not your diner, Mom, it's mine. Dad left it too." "I don't care whose name is on the deed," Diane snapped, and something in her voice cracked slightly the way it always did when the subject of Frank came up sideways instead of head-on. "I care that you are giving away food we cannot afford to give away to a man off the street while I am lying awake every night doing math that doesn't add up. Do you understand what happens if we're late on that mortgage payment again? Do you understand what that family already did to us once?" Ruby's jaw tightened. "This has nothing to do with the Vances." "Everything has to do with the Vances," Diane said, quieter now but no less sharp. "You were 14 years old when your father signed that loan. I watched him age 10 years in 18 months trying to keep up with payments that kept somehow getting bigger instead of smaller. I watched it kill him slowly, long before his heart actually gave out." She pressed her lips together. "So forgive me if I have very little patience left for charity, Ruby. We are 3 payments away from losing the only thing your father left us, and you are giving strangers pancakes for free." "He's not just a stranger," Ruby said before she could stop herself. Diane's eyes narrowed. "What does that mean?" Ruby hesitated, and in that hesitation her mother saw everything she needed to see. "His name is Owen," Ruby said carefully. "He's been coming in for 3 days. I don't know his whole story, but I know he's not dangerous, Mom, and I know he's had a rough time, and I am not going to stop feeding a hungry person because it might cost us a few dollars in eggs. A few dollars in eggs adds up to rent, Ruby Ann." Diane's voice had gone thin and tight. "I raised you better than to fall for some sad story from a man sitting on a sidewalk. You have no idea who he is. He could be dangerous. He could be using you. Men like that. Men like what?" Mom Ruby's own voice rose now, something rare for her. A flash of the stubbornness she had inherited whole from her father. "Men who are down on their luck. Men who don't have anything and still deserve to be treated like human beings." Diane's face went very still, and for a moment, something passed across it that looked almost like fear rather than anger. She reached across the table and gripped Ruby's hand hard. "I need you to listen to me," she said, low and urgent. "Preston Vance has been asking about you." Ruby pulled her hand back like she'd been burned. "What?" "Preston Vance." Diane said the name again, deliberately watching Ruby's reaction. "Karen Whitfield's cousin does the books for Vance Development, and apparently Preston mentioned you by name at some fundraiser 2 weeks ago. Asked around. Found out you run this place." Diane's voice had shifted, now softened into something that was trying badly to sound hopeful instead of desperate. "Ruby, do you understand what that family is worth? Preston could take care of you. Take care of all of us. This diner's roof, the mortgage, everything gone just like that if you gave him half a chance. You want me to marry a man I've never even spoken to, Ruby said flatly, because his family has money. I want you to stop drowning, Diane said. And for one unguarded second, her voice broke entirely, and Ruby saw underneath 30 years of hardness a woman who had watched her husband work himself into an early grave trying to keep a roof over his daughter's head, who had spent every night since counting and recounting numbers that never came out even. I want you to have a life easier than the one I had. Is that so terrible? Your father worked himself to death trying to give you something, and I am not going to sit here and watch you throw away a chance at security because some man on a street corner made you feel sorry for him. Ruby stood chair scraping hard against the linoleum. Dad wouldn't have wanted this, she said quietly. He wouldn't have wanted me picking a husband like I was picking a bank loan. Your father, Diane said, her voice suddenly cold again, left us with nothing but a diner and a mortgage that nearly buried us. Don't you dare stand there and tell me what he would have wanted, when he's not the one who's had to figure out how to keep the lights on since he's been gone. The words landed hard, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the kitchen filled only with the tick of the radiator and the distant sound of traffic outside. It was in that silence that Ruby's younger sister Chloe appeared in the doorway, still in pajamas, arms crossed, watching the two of them with an expression that was equal parts boredom and something sharper underneath. Let me guess, Chloe said. Ruby's fallen in love with a homeless guy and Mom's trying to marry her off to a Vance instead. She rolled her eyes and reached past both of them for the coffee pot. Honestly, Ruby, for once in your life, could you just pick the option that doesn't end in either of us drowning? Ruby started. No, really, Chloe said, pouring herself a cup with exaggerated casualness. You get everything. The good grades, Dad's whole diner, and now apparently two men fighting over you, one broke, one loaded, and somehow you're going to find a way to be miserable about both of them. She took a sip, watching Ruby over the rim of the mug with an expression that didn't quite manage to hide the old familiar sting underneath the sarcasm. Must be nice. It's not a competition, Chloe. Everything's a competition, Chloe said simply, and left the kitchen without another word, taking the coffee with her. Diane sighed, some of the fight going out of her shoulders, replaced by a tiredness that seemed to sit permanently behind her eyes these days. Preston is coming by the diner Friday afternoon, she said, quieter now, just to introduce himself. That's all I'm asking, Ruby. One conversation. You don't have to marry the man. Just give the possibility a chance to exist before you throw it away for a stranger you've known 3 days. Ruby stood in the middle of the small kitchen, torn between the exhausted love she still felt for her mother and the stubborn certainty settling low in her chest, a certainty she couldn't fully explain, rooted in nothing more than the way a hungry stranger's eyes had gone soft and grateful over a plate of eggs, in a way that felt more honest than anything Preston Vance's name had ever promised her. Fine, she said finally. One conversation. Friday. She grabbed her apron off the back of the chair and headed for the door, pausing only long enough to add quietly without turning around. But I'm still feeding Owen breakfast tomorrow morning, Mom. That's not up for negotiation. She stepped out into the cold gray light of early morning, the bell above the diner's back door jingling faintly behind her as it swung shut, carrying with her the uneasy weight of a promise made to keep the peace and the quieter, steadier certainty of a promise made to herself that she had no intention of breaking. Rain moved through Denver overnight, leaving the streets slick and dark by the time Owen made his way back toward Callahan's diner the next morning. The collar of his jacket turned up against a wind that had teeth in it, now autumn, tipping steadily toward something colder. He had not slept well. Ruby's words from the day before kept circling back through his mind. When you see somebody who's fallen down, you give them your hand first, alongside the photograph still folded in his coat pocket, the one that had not left his possession since Sam handed it to him. He reached the diner before it opened while the closed sign still hung crooked in the window, and stood for a moment across the street watching the building in the gray early light. He noticed this time what he hadn't let himself notice before, the water stain spreading dark across the ceiling tiles near the front window, visible even from outside, the way one corner of the roofline sagged slightly where a gutter had pulled loose from its bracket. The plywood patch nailed over what had once clearly been a second window, now sealed shut entirely rather than repaired. He thought of a $50,000 chandelier hanging in the lobby of Hale Brewing's headquarters, replaced 18 months ago, simply because the design team felt the old one looked dated. By the time Ruby unlocked the front door at 6:15, Owen had already made a decision. He didn't tell her that morning. He sat at his usual stool, ate the eggs and toast she set in front of him without a word about payment. Listened to her tell a story about a regular customer who'd once tried to pay his tab with a live chicken, and laughed something that had happened so rarely in the past month, that it startled him almost as much as it seemed to startle her. But that afternoon, once the lunch rush thinned and Ruby disappeared into the back office to wrestle with the week's invoices, Owen slipped out the side door and made 2 phone calls from a payphone 3 blocks away, one to a contractor he trusted to keep his mouth shut, and one to Sam. "I need cash," Owen said, "and I need it to look like it came from anywhere but me." How much Sam asked, already knowing the answer would be more than made sense for a man 3 weeks into a homelessness experiment to be requesting. Enough to fix a roof. Enough to cover a mortgage payment quietly without anyone tracing it back. Owen's voice had steadied into the tone Sam recognized from boardrooms, the one that meant a decision had already been made, and discussion was merely a formality. Route it through the Community Assistance Fund the company already runs. Make it look like a routine small business grant. Nobody's name attached, but a program that already exists. Sam was quiet for a moment. "You're not ready to tell her who you are?" "Not yet," Owen said. "If I do this and she finds out it was me, it stops being a gift and starts being a transaction. I need her to just receive something good for once, without it costing her a debt to someone." 3 days later, a roofing crew showed up at Callahan's diner, without warning citations from a city small business hardship program in hand, informing a stunned Ruby that her building had been selected quietly anonymously for a structural repair grant funded through a local business coalition. The gutter was rehung. The water-damaged section of roof was patched, then properly reshingled. An envelope slid under the office door sometime during the chaos of the repair crew's arrival, held $4,000 in cash and a single typed note. "For the ones who feed strangers without asking why. A grateful passerby." Ruby read the note twice, sitting alone in the back office with the envelope open on the desk in front of her, her hands trembling slightly. She thought immediately of Owen, not because it made any logical sense that a homeless man could be behind an anonymous business grant, but because something about the phrase, "the ones who feed strangers without asking why," felt too specific, too close to her own life to be coincidence. She found him the next morning at his usual stool. "Did you have anything to do with this?" she asked, sliding the note across the counter toward him before he'd even finished his coffee. Owen's stomach dropped. He looked at the note, then at her face, searching, uncertain, hopeful, in a way that made lying to her feel almost unbearable, and chose his words with more care than he'd chosen anything in weeks. "I don't have that kind of money, Ruby," he said, which was in the strictest technical sense true of the man sitting on that stool. "But I'm glad somebody out there noticed what you're doing here. You deserve to have something go right for once." Ruby studied him a moment longer, some flicker of doubt crossing her face before she folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket. "It's strange timing, that's all," she said. "Feels like the universe finally decided to give this place a break." "Maybe it did," Owen said quietly, and let the moment pass without correction. That evening, after her shift ended and the diner had emptied out, Ruby lingered at the counter longer than usual, wiping down surfaces that were already clean, working up to something Owen could see coming from the careful way she avoided his eyes. "I need to tell you something," she said, finally reaching under the counter and pulling out a small worn envelope of her own, thick with folded bills held together with a rubber band that had clearly been wrapped and rewrapped many times over the years. "This is everything I've saved. 3 years of tips, birthday, money, whatever I could scrape together after bills. $8,200. She set it on the counter between them, pushing it slightly toward him. "I want you to have it." Owen stared at the envelope like it had appeared out of thin air. "Ruby, no. Absolutely not." "I've thought about this a lot," she said before he could refuse further, her voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. "I don't know your whole story, Owen. I don't need to know it to see you're a good person who's been dealt a terrible hand. This is enough to get a deposit on a room somewhere, maybe start something, I don't know, whatever it is you used to do before things fell apart. You don't need a fortune to prove you're worth something. You just need one chance. I can't take this from you." Owen pushed the envelope back toward her, his throat tight, something in his chest twisting painfully at the sight of 3 years of a struggling woman's savings, sitting between them on a diner counter. "This is your safety net. Your mortgage payment. You can't just give this away to someone who needs it more than I need a safety net." "I've never once actually used," Ruby cut in gently but firmly. "Owen, I've been saving this money for 3 years and I don't even know what I was saving it for. Some vague idea of someday. But you need it right now, today, and I'd rather it do some good in the world than sit in an envelope collecting dust while I wait for a someday that never quite comes." She pushed it toward him again, more firmly this time. "Please, let me do this." Owen looked at the envelope, then at her, This woman who had in the space of a week upended everything he thought he understood about kindness, about what people were willing to give when they thought there was nothing to gain, and felt something crack open in his chest. Some old guarded certainty, giving way entirely. He did not take the money. He couldn't, not really, not when he had access to more wealth than she could imagine, sitting in accounts 3 blocks from where they stood. But he let his hand rest briefly over hers on the counter over the envelope and said the only thing that felt true enough to say. "You don't need to give me anything else, Ruby," he said quietly. "You already gave me the thing I came looking for." She frowned slightly, not understanding, and he didn't explain further. Couldn't, not yet, not without unraveling the entire fragile arrangement of the last week. Instead, he gently folded her fingers back around the envelope and pushed it toward her. "Keep it," he said. "Not because I don't need it. Because you're going to need it more than you think, sooner than you think, and I want you to have it when that day comes." Ruby looked at him for a long moment, something searching and uncertain in her eyes, before she finally nodded and slid the envelope back beneath the counter. Neither of them could have known, standing there in the quiet closing hours of a small diner on 13th and Pearl, that within days the fragile peace they'd built would collapse entirely, not because of anything either of them had done, but because a video clip 3 weeks old and recently rediscovered by the wrong pair of eyes was about to make its way back into Diane Callahan's kitchen and detonate everything Ruby had been quietly building, one plate of eggs at a time. Sam Whitfield had not stopped digging since the night he laid the photograph of Frank Callahan on the bathroom tile between himself and Owen. What began as a routine trace on a predatory mortgage had over the following days spread outward into something far larger than either of them had anticipated, a tangle of shell companies holding accounts and buried filings that all led eventually back to the same name. He was sitting in his office on the 14th floor of Hale Brewing's headquarters late on a Tuesday night, the city lights of Denver spread out silver and gold beyond the window, when he found the document that made his blood run cold. It was buried 3 subsidiaries deep in Vance Development's old financial filings from 15 years earlier. The same year, Sam realized with a slow, sick certainty that Owen had fled his stepfather's house for good. A disbursement modest by the standards of a real estate empire, but enormous for the man receiving it, $42,000, paid out to a private individual under a non-disclosure and release agreement, routed through a consulting shell called Larkspur Advisory, the same street name. Sam realized with a jolt, as the house Owen had described 3 nights earlier, the porch, the locket, the sentence cut off mid-word. The recipient's name was Roy Tanner. Sam sat frozen in his chair for a long moment, staring at the screen, rereading the name 3 times to be certain his exhausted eyes weren't inventing it. Then he pulled the file's metadata, cross-referenced the date against Hale Brewing's own corporate history, and felt something cold settle permanently into his chest. 15 years ago, in the exact quarter that Owen's father's original brewery had been preparing its first outside investment round, the very deal that would eventually seed the empire, Owen built everything on top of Vance. Development had been circling the same investment opportunity, hoping to acquire a controlling stake before the Hale family name became valuable enough to be worth protecting. And in that same quarter, a payment had gone out to a man named Roy Tanner, structured carefully as a consulting release, in exchange for his signature on a document that, buried in legal language 3 pages deep, required him to relinquish all parental and custodial claims, vacate the state of Colorado within 30 days, and never contact any member of the Hale family again. Sam read it 4 times before the full shape of it assembled itself in his mind. The Vances had not simply happened to profit from Owen's suffering years later. They had been present at the very moment Owen's family fractured, present enough to know exactly what kind of man Roy Tanner was, present enough to see an opportunity in it, and instead of intervening on behalf of a 9-year-old boy who had just watched his mother disappear from his life, they had paid the abuser to vanish quietly, protecting their own path to a business deal, leaving a broken and frightened child to be absorbed into the system with no one left standing behind him. Sam printed the document with shaking hands. He drove to Owen's penthouse at nearly midnight, and when Owen opened the door, still awake, still dressed in the same worn clothes he'd worn on the street that day, unable to fully let go of the disguise even indoors anymore, Sam simply held the paper out without a word, watching his friend's face as he read it, watching the exact moment understanding landed. "No," Owen said quietly, reading it a second time, then a third, his voice growing thinner with each pass. "No, this can't be, Sam. This doesn't say what I think it says." "It says exactly what you think it says," Sam said, his own voice unsteady with barely restrained fury. Vance Development paid Roy Tanner $42,000 to disappear right around the same time they were trying to muscle in on your father's brewery, before it became worth anything. They knew who Roy was. Owen. Nobody structures a payout with an NDA and a state vacate clause unless they already understand exactly what kind of man they're paying off. They had to have known what was happening in that house. And instead of getting you out, instead of calling anyone who could have actually helped a 9-year-old kid, they paid him to leave quietly. Owen finished the words coming out flat and hollow so the story could just become, Owen's mother left, and his stepfather raised him clean enough that nobody ever asked uncomfortable questions while they finished trying to buy their way into my father's company. Sam nodded grimly. The deal fell through in the end. Your father found other investors, kept full control, and Vance Development moved on to easier targets. I don't think this ever mattered enough to them to remember Owen. I think you were just collateral damage in a business maneuver that didn't even work. His jaw tightened, which somehow makes it worse. Owen sat down heavily on the arm of the couch, the document trembling slightly in his hand. 15 years of believing his mother had simply chosen to leave, that some fundamental flaw in him had made staying impossible for her, and underneath that story the entire time had been a business transaction. A man paid to disappear. A family who had looked at a child suffering and calculated coldly whether it represented an opportunity or an obstacle and had chosen not to intervene either way, simply to let it play out while they pursued something more profitable elsewhere. And now, Owen said, slowly, the full shape of it finally landing. Preston Vance is sitting across a diner counter from Ruby Callahan every Friday trying to marry into the one family who ever showed me an ounce of real kindness in this entire city. The same family the Vances helped nearly destroy twice over. Once through her father's mortgage, and once 15 years before that through mine. I don't think Preston knows any of this history, Sam said carefully. This looks like it was buried deep enough, deliberately enough, that it predates him being old enough to understand what his father's company was doing. But Owen, he hesitated. I don't think that makes it better. It just means the rot goes back further than one bad son. It means this is who that family is generation after generation. See an opportunity, calculate the cost of somebody else's suffering, and choose the version that benefits them. Owen stood abruptly, crossing to the window, staring down at the lights of a city that had no idea what had just been uncovered 14 floors above its streets. They didn't just cost me my mother, he said, his voice low and shaking with something that was no longer only grief but had hardened finally into something sharper. They cost Ruby's father. His health slowly killed him under a debt he never should have owed. And now they're circling his daughter like nothing ever happened. Like none of it costs anything to anyone but the people standing in the way of what they want. What do you want to do? Sam asked quietly. Owen was silent for a long moment, watching his own reflection ghosted faintly against the glass superimposed over the glittering city beyond it. When he finally spoke, his voice had steadied into something colder and more certain than Sam had heard from him in weeks. I want to know everything, Owen said. Every filing, every account, every deal the Vances have touched in the last 20 years. I want to know exactly what Preston's fortune is actually built on, because a family capable of paying off an abuser to protect a business deal is not a family that suddenly became honest by the time their son grew up. He turned from the window, and in the lamplight his face looked older than it had an hour ago, carved through with a grief that had finally found somewhere useful to go. And I want to be standing in that room, Sam, the day the truth comes out. Not as the man on the sidewalk, not hiding behind a disguise anymore. I want Ruby to see exactly who's been protecting her family this whole time, and I want the Vances to understand once and for all that the boy they paid to disappear 15 years ago built something bigger than anything they ever managed to buy. Sam looked at his oldest friend for a long moment, seeing in him for the first time since this entire strange experiment began. Not a wounded man testing the world for proof of kindness, but something closer to the boy Frank Callahan had once fed quietly night after night without ever knowing what that small act of decency would one day grow into. Then let's get to work, Sam said quietly, because I don't think we have much time before Preston pushes for something more than Friday afternoon conversations. Outside the window, Denver's lights burned on into the night, indifferent as ever to the quiet reckoning assembling itself 14 floors above the street, a reckoning that would not wait much longer to make itself known. The video had been circulating for 3 weeks by the time it found its way at last into the one kitchen Owen had hoped it never would. It happened on a Thursday evening. The diner already closed, the open sign flipped to its darker side, when Diane Callahan sat at her kitchen table scrolling through her phone with the particular restless energy of a woman who couldn't sleep and didn't want to admit why. She had seen the clip once before, weeks earlier, in passing, Danny Ruiz's wife had sent it as a curiosity. Can you believe this used to be somebody kind of message? And Diane had watched 30 seconds of it and moved on without much thought. This time a different post stopped her scrolling cold. A local news account had picked up the story, stitched together footage from Rachel Doyle's original video, with photographs pulled from old Denver Post archives, and built the whole thing into a segment titled, "From Golden Boy to Gutter. Whatever happened to Owen Hale?" Diane's thumb froze over the screen. Owen Hale. She had heard the name before everyone in Denver had, at some point in the way you half remember the name of any local company whose beer occasionally showed up at a backyard barbecue. Hale Brewing Company. She read further, her stomach tightening. With each line, founder and chairman. Net worth estimated in the hundreds of millions. Company representatives have declined to comment on his recent disappearance from public life. Sources close to the family speculate a mental health crisis or possible substance abuse issue may be behind his sudden vanishing act. And then near the bottom, a still image pulled from the video, a thin man with hollow eyes and a patchy beard sitting against a brick wall on Larimer Square wearing a coat 2 sizes too large. Diane stared at the photograph for a long time before the shape of the man's face resolved itself into someone she recognized. Not from the news. From her own kitchen counter. From the stool at the end of the diner where Ruby had been serving free breakfast to a supposed stranger for nearly 2 weeks now. She stood so quickly her chair scraped hard against the floor. Ruby. Her voice tore through the small house sharp enough that Chloe appeared in her bedroom doorway down the hall, startled. Ruby came out of her room already half-dressed for the early shift, pulling her hair back into its usual braid. "Mom, what's—" Diane held out the phone, her hand shaking. "Is this him? Is this the man you've been feeding every morning?" Ruby took the phone slowly, and the moment the image loaded fully on the screen, something in her chest dropped straight through the floor. She recognized the coat. Recognized the exact tilt of his shoulders, the particular way he held himself when he thought no one was really looking. She scrolled up, reading the headline, reading the words founder and chairman, reading hundreds of millions, and felt the entire last 2 weeks rearrange themselves in her mind into something she no longer recognized. "I don't understand," Ruby said, her voice thin. "You don't understand," Diane repeated, something between fury and disbelief cracking through her voice. "Ruby, this man is worth more money than either of us will see in 10 lifetimes. And he's been sitting on a stool in our diner every single morning letting you feed him for free like some kind of charity case. And you didn't think that was worth mentioning to your own mother." "I didn't know," Ruby said, and it came out smaller than she meant it to, because underneath the shock was something else entirely, a hurt. She couldn't yet name, a feeling of having been in some way she didn't fully understand. Deceived. "Mom, I swear to you I had no idea. He told me he didn't have any money. He let me believe. He let you believe a lot of things, apparently." Diane's voice had gone cold now, the fear underneath her anger sharpening into something more familiar and manageable. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. You don't know these men, Ruby. You don't know what they want or why they lie or what happens to girls who trust the wrong story." By morning, the story had grown teeth. Someone, Ruby never learned exactly who, though she suspected Rachel Doyle, riding the sudden viral attention her original video had generated, had tracked down the diner's location and posted it publicly, tagging it in the comments, beneath the growing thread of speculation. "This is the waitress feeding him," the post read alongside a blurry photo taken through the diner's front window, Ruby's face clearly visible mid-laugh. Pouring coffee for a man the internet had already decided was either a broken tragedy or an elaborate con artist, depending on which corner of the comment section you read. By the time Ruby arrived for her shift, 3 strangers were already waiting outside the diner with phones raised. "Are you the one who's been feeding the Hale heir?" one of them called out as she approached, and Ruby's stomach lurched at the phrase, at how strange and wrong it sounded applied to a man who had sat quietly at her counter thanking her again and again for scrambled eggs. "Is it true you didn't know who he was?" another asked. "Some people are saying this whole thing's staged like a publicity stunt for the company. What do you think?" Ruby pushed past them without answering hands, trembling as she unlocked the door, and once inside she leaned back against it, breathing hard, feeling for the first time in her adult life, like the small, familiar world of Callahan's diner had been cracked open and exposed to something far larger and far crueler than anything she'd ever prepared herself for. Owen did not come in that morning. She told herself it didn't matter, told herself over the course of a long, strange shift, spent fielding curious stares, and at least 4 more strangers with phones, that she had no reason to feel abandoned by a man she'd known for barely 2 weeks. A man who had by any reasonable measure lied to her about the single most basic fact of who he was. But by closing time, when the stool at the end of the counter had sat empty through breakfast, lunch, and the slow afternoon lull, something heavier than confusion had settled in her chest. She didn't know that 4 blocks away, Owen sat in the back of Sam's car outside the Hale Brewing headquarters, staring at his own phone, scrolling through the same viral thread, with a kind of sick, helpless dread, watching in real time as the fragile, honest thing he'd built with Ruby got picked apart and repackaged into a story about money and manipulation that had nothing to do with the truth. He didn't know either what was happening at that same moment, inside a modest rental house across town, where Diane Callahan rattled, frightened, and now armed with a name and a net worth that changed everything about how she understood the danger her daughter was in, picked up her phone, and with hands that shook more from urgency than doubt, dialed a number she had been given weeks earlier, at a fundraiser she'd only half wanted to attend. Preston, Diane said when the line connected, her voice steadying itself into something careful and deliberate. It's Diane Callahan. I think it's time we moved that Friday conversation up. Tonight, if you're free. Somewhere in that call, though neither woman making it could have known, the last quiet, uncomplicated days of Ruby Callahan's life were already coming to a close, and the storm that had been building quietly for 2 weeks was about to break wide open, sweeping everyone in its path toward a reckoning none of them yet understood was coming. Preston Vance arrived at the Callahan house at 7 that evening, driving a car that cost more than the house itself, dressed in the kind of casual blazer that had clearly been chosen to look effortless, and had in fact taken considerable effort. He carried a small bouquet of white peonies, handed them to Diane at the door with a practiced smile, and complimented the charm of the neighborhood in a tone that made clear he had never once considered living in one like it. Ruby sat through dinner with her jaw tight, and her eyes fixed mostly on her plate, answering Preston's questions in clipped, polite sentences, while her mother filled every silence with bright, anxious chatter about the diner, Ruby's work ethic, about how hard her daughter worked, being deserving she was of some ease in her life. Chloe watched the whole performance from across the table, with poorly disguised amusement occasionally catching Ruby's eye just long enough to arch an eyebrow. Preston, for his part, seemed entirely undisturbed by Ruby's reticence. If anything, he appeared to find it charming, the challenge of it, the novelty of a woman not immediately falling over herself in his presence. I like that you're not impressed by any of this, he said at one point, gesturing vaguely at himself at the car visible through the window, at the general fact of being a Vance. Most women start planning the wedding by dessert. I'm not most women, Ruby said flatly, and Diane shot her a warning look across the table that Ruby chose to ignore. By the time Preston left close to 9, he paused at the door and took Ruby's hand in both of his, a gesture that felt to Ruby less like affection and more like a man closing a deal he considered already settled. I don't like to wait for things I want, he said, echoing something he'd apparently said to her once before, weeks ago, in a chance encounter Ruby barely remembered. But I can be patient if patience is what it takes. I'll be back Sunday. He left before Ruby could respond, and the moment the door closed behind him, Diane exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for the entire evening. He's perfectly nice, Ruby, she said. Charming, successful, clearly interested in you. What more could you possibly? I don't love him, Mom. Ruby's voice was quiet but absolute. I don't even know him. You don't need to love someone on the first dinner, Diane said. Love is something that grows if you let it. Your father and I. Dad worked at a diner his whole life, and never once cared what anyone thought about it. Ruby cut in sharper than she meant to. You act like poor and dishonest are the same thing, and rich and good are the same thing, and neither one is true, Mom. I've seen more real kindness from a man with nothing than I've seen in one dinner with a man who has everything. Diane's face tightened, hurt flickering behind the frustration. That man lied to you, Ruby, about who he was, about everything, and you're still defending him over a man who's been honest with you from the start. Ruby had no answer for that. She went to bed that night with the argument circling unresolved in her chest, and across town in a very different kind of house. A similar argument was unfolding between 2 men who had known each other for 17 years. Sam Whitfield had not slept properly in days. The discovery of Vance Development's payment to Roy Tanner had cracked something open in him. A protectiveness toward Owen that had always run deep now sharpened into something closer to vigilance. He had spent the better part of the week compiling everything he could find on the Vance family's finances, and in the process, a colder, more suspicious question had begun to take root in his mind, one he hadn't yet set out. Too loud. He said it now, standing in Owen's office at nearly midnight, the 2 of them alone with a single lamp burning against the dark windows. I need to say something, and I need you to actually hear it instead of getting defensive, Sam said. Owen looked up from the papers spread across his desk, wary already at the tone. Say it. What if Ruby knew? Sam asked. Not from the start, I don't think that. But what if somewhere in the last week or two she figured out who you were, and instead of telling you, she kept playing the part, a homeless billionaire sitting alone at her counter every morning, clearly starving for exactly the kind of unconditional kindness she's been offering him. That's not a hard read for a smart woman. Owen and Ruby is smart. What if the savings she offered you, the whole performance of selflessness, was calculated? What if she's been auditioning for exactly the role she thinks a man like you is looking for? Owen's jaw tightened. You don't believe that. I don't know what I believe anymore, Sam admitted, running a hand roughly through his hair. I believe her father was a good man. I believe that much completely. But good fathers don't automatically raise daughters incapable of using an advantage when they see one, especially a daughter who's watched her family nearly lose everything to the very people now circling her with an engagement ring. I'm not saying she's a villain, Owen. I'm saying I've watched you get hurt exactly once in your life, badly enough to build a 9-figure company just to prove a point to a mother who might not even deserve the effort, and I am not going to stand by and watch it happen a second time without at least checking. Checking how? Owen said, his voice low. Sam hesitated. I want to follow her. One night, just to see what she does when she thinks no one's watching, no cameras, no audience, no you sitting on that stool giving her a reason to perform. If everything I'm afraid of is wrong, I'll never bring it up again, and I'll apologize to her myself. But if I'm right, you're not going to be right, Owen said, and the certainty in his voice surprised even him. Then let me prove it, Sam said. Let me be wrong, Owen. I want to be wrong. But I need to know for certain before you walk into that gala in 5 days and hand this woman your whole life in front of every camera in Colorado. Owen was silent for a long moment, staring down at the papers on his desk, bank filings, shell companies, the slow architecture of a family that had once calculated a 9-year-old's suffering as an acceptable cost of doing business. He thought of Ruby's hands pushing an envelope of 3 years' savings across the counter toward him. He thought of the note in her father's own words passed down like scripture: you give them your hand first, you ask questions later. And still beneath all of it, a small, old, familiar fear stirred, the same fear that had sent him onto that sidewalk on Larimer Square in the first place, the fear that had followed him since he was 9 years old on a porch in Wheat Ridge, the fear that kindness, when examined closely enough, always turned out to have an angle. Fine, Owen said, finally, the word costing him more than Sam could see. One night. But Sam. He looked up, and something raw and pleading had entered his voice, a vulnerability he rarely allowed even his oldest friend to witness. If you're wrong, you tell her the truth about what we did. All of it. Because if I've learned anything in the last 2 weeks, it's that the only thing worse than being deceived is deceiving someone who never deserved it. Sam nodded slowly, already regretting the plan, even as he agreed to carry it out. Some old instinct, telling him that whatever he found tomorrow night was going to matter far more and cut far deeper than either of them was currently prepared for. Outside the window, Denver's skyline glittered on into the night, indifferent to the quiet, uneasy alliance being tested inside two men's oldest friendship. An alliance about to be tested even further by whatever truth waited, unwitnessed in the ordinary hours of Ruby Callahan's private life. Sam Whitfield parked half a block from Callahan's diner just after 10 that night. Engine off, lights off, a paper cup of gas station, coffee going cold in the cup holder beside him. He told himself as he settled in to wait that this was simply due diligence, the same instinct that had made him check every investor, every partnership, every deal Owen had ever entertained over 17 years of friendship. He told himself he wanted to be wrong. He did not entirely believe himself. Ruby emerged from the diner's side door a little after 10:30, apron gone, a worn canvas jacket pulled over her uniform, a small paper bag tucked under one arm. Sam eased the car forward slowly, keeping a careful distance, watching her walk east along Pearl Street with the quick, purposeful stride of someone who had somewhere specific to be. She did not go toward the bus stop or toward home. She turned down a side street, Sam recognized as leading toward the underpass near the light rail station, the kind of place people avoided after dark, where a handful of the city's homeless population had for years quietly gathered, in the relative shelter of the concrete overhang. Sam parked again and watched through the windshield, phone raised, telling himself he was documenting evidence, not entirely sure anymore what kind of evidence he was hoping to find. Ruby crouched down beside an elderly woman bundled in blankets against the concrete wall, and Sam watched her open the paper bag, a sandwich, an apple, a bottle of water, the same kind of meal, Sam realized with a small jolt, that he himself had once handed Owen in the front seat of this very car. Ruby said something Sam couldn't hear, and the old woman laughed, a thin, papery sound that carried faintly across the empty street. Ruby reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small roll of bills, her tips from the night's shift Sam would later learn nearly $60, and pressed them into the woman's weathered hands, closing the woman's fingers around the money gently when she tried weakly to refuse. You earned it more than I did tonight, Miss. Ruby said, her voice finally carrying to where Sam sat frozen behind the wheel. Now eat something warm before it gets cold and I'll see you Thursday. Sam lowered the phone slowly, something uncomfortable twisting in his chest. He almost started the engine, then almost drove away with what he'd already seen, but something kept him rooted in place, a growing uneasy sense that the night had more to show him than he'd planned for. Ruby's phone rang as she walked back toward Pearl Street, and she answered it without slowing her pace, her voice carrying clearly in the quiet night air. Preston, it's almost 11, is everything? She stopped walking abruptly. Sam watched her posture change, shoulders going rigid, one hand pressing flat against her forehead. A check. Preston, I told you at dinner I'm not. No, I don't want $50,000 deposited into an account I didn't ask you to open. That's not a gift, that's... A long pause, Ruby's jaw tightening visibly even from a distance. I understand you meant it as a gesture, but I'm not for sale, Preston. I'm hanging up now. She ended the call, stood still on the sidewalk for a moment, breathing hard, and then pulled a folded piece of paper from her jacket pocket, a check. Sam realized that Preston must have physically handed her at dinner one she'd apparently been carrying around all evening, unable to decide what to do with it. She stared at it under the orange glow of a street lamp for a long moment. Then, with a motion so sudden and final it made Sam sit up straight in his seat, she tore it neatly in half, then in half again, and dropped the pieces into a trash can bolted to the corner post. I don't want his money, she said out loud to no one, her voice thin but steady in the empty street. I never wanted his money. Sam sat in stunned silence, watching her walk the rest of the way home, every assumption he'd carried into this night dismantling itself piece by piece. He thought of the envelope of savings she'd tried to give Owen. He thought of the roll of tip money just handed to a stranger sleeping under an overpass. He thought of a $50,000 check torn to pieces and thrown away without a second thought by a woman who couldn't reliably make her own mortgage payment. He was reaching for the ignition, ready to drive straight to Owen's penthouse and admit fully, and without qualification, how wrong he'd been when his phone buzzed with a call from an unknown number, a butt dial he would later realize from a phone that had accidentally connected while sitting in someone's jacket pocket. He almost declined it. Something made him answer instead. Don't understand why you're being so difficult about this. Diane Callahan's voice came through, muffled but clear enough. Clearly unaware the call had connected at all. I already told the Vance family I'd handle her. You said yourself this arrangement benefits everyone, so I don't see why. A second voice, one Sam didn't immediately recognize, cut in smoother and more careful. Mrs. Callahan, I understand your position, but my father needs assurance this engagement will actually proceed before the second payment clears. $15,000 was the agreed figure for securing the introduction. The remaining $35,000 is contingent on an actual engagement announcement. Sam's blood went cold. She'll come around, Diane, said, her voice tight with something that sounded even through the static like a woman trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. She's stubborn, but she's not stupid. Once she understands what this diner actually needs to survive, she'll see reason. I just need a little more time. You have until the gala, the smoother voice said. My father's patience isn't infinite, Mrs. Callahan, and frankly neither is mine. The call cut off abruptly, the phone shifting position in someone's pocket, severing the connection, leaving Sam sitting frozen behind the wheel of his car, staring at a screen gone dark, his mind racing to assemble what he'd just overheard into something coherent. Diane Callahan had taken money from the Vance family, a payment to secure an introduction between Ruby and Preston with a far larger sum contingent on an actual engagement, meaning Diane knew at some level that this wasn't simply a mother hoping for her daughter's security. This was a transaction brokered behind Ruby's back by the very family whose predatory loan had once nearly destroyed her father. And underneath it, a second realization landed with even heavier weight. If the Vance family was this determined, this financially desperate to secure an actual engagement, willing to pay a struggling widow to manufacture, Preston's family fortune actually consisted of was almost certainly far less solid than its glittering surface suggested. Sam drove straight to Owen's penthouse, breaking 2 traffic laws along the way, and let himself in without knocking, finding Owen still awake, sitting exactly where he'd left him hours earlier, staring at nothing in particular. I was wrong, Sam said before Owen could even ask, his voice raw with something between shame and urgency. I was completely entirely wrong, and I need you to forgive me for doubting her, because what I just watched was the single most selfless thing I have ever seen a person do with money they didn't have to spare. He dropped into the chair across from Owen, still catching his breath. But that's not even the worst part of what I found tonight. Owen straightened slowly, reading the shift in Sam's expression. Tell me. Diane Callahan is being paid by the Vance family, Sam said. $15,000, already $35,000 more if the engagement actually happens. And Preston's own business partner, or whoever that was on the phone, sounded genuinely nervous about their finances holding up long enough to see it through. Sam leaned forward, gripping the arms of the chair. Owen, I don't think Preston Vance has the fortune everyone thinks he has. I think this family is drowning. And Ruby Callahan is the life raft they're trying to buy their way onto. Owen sat in silence. For a long moment, the pieces of two separate devastating truths settling into place at once. Ruby's fierce, unbought integrity on one side, and on the other, a mother desperate enough, frightened enough to sell her daughter's future to the very family that had helped destroy her husband's health without ever telling Ruby the truth of what was being traded away. We have 5 days until the gala, Owen said finally, his voice hardening into something resolute. I'm done hiding, Sam. It's time Ruby knew exactly who I am, and it's time the Vance family learned exactly what happens when the people they've spent 2 decades quietly exploiting finally have the resources to fight back. The days following Sam's discovery moved with a strange, taut quiet, the kind that settles over a house before a storm everyone can feel coming but no one wants to name. Owen had not yet found the right moment to tell Ruby the truth. Sam had urged caution, insisting they gather full documentation on the Vance family's finances before Owen revealed himself, so that when the truth finally came out, it would come out complete, undeniable. Impossible for Preston or Diane to spin into something more forgivable than it was. 2 more days, Sam had said. Let me finish building the case. Then you tell her everything on your terms before anyone else has the chance to do it for you. Owen had agreed reluctantly, though every hour that passed without telling Ruby the truth felt like a small, accumulating betrayal of his own making. He still came to the diner each morning. Ruby still poured his coffee, still slid a plate in front of him without being asked, though something had shifted subtly in her manner since the article broke a new watchfulness in her eyes, a question she hadn't yet asked out loud, but which hovered unmistakably in every pause between them. You could have told me, she said quietly on the 3rd morning, setting his plate down with more care than usual, not quite meeting his eyes. Owen's stomach tightened. Ruby, I'm not asking for the whole story right now, she said, cutting him off gently. I can see there's more to it than what's online. I just need to know that when you're ready to tell me, you're going to tell me yourself, not let me find out from a stranger's phone. I promise, Owen said, and meant it more fully than he'd meant almost anything in years. 2 more days, Ruby. I swear to you, 2 more days and you'll know everything. She nodded slowly, something in her posture easing slightly, though the watchfulness didn't fully leave her eyes. What neither of them knew was that Chloe Callahan had been listening from the storeroom doorway, arms crossed, jaw tight, watching her older sister extend patience and trust to a man the whole internet had spent 2 weeks dissecting patience. Chloe herself had never once been offered for anything in her life. Chloe was 22, 3 years younger than Ruby, and had spent the better part of her adult life standing in a shadow she hadn't chosen and couldn't seem to step out of. Ruby had inherited the diner. Ruby had inherited their father's quiet, unshakable moral certainty, the kind that made people trust her instantly, the kind Chloe had never managed to fake convincingly even when she tried. And now, apparently, Ruby had also managed to attract not 1 but 2 wealthy men fighting for her attention, while Chloe worked a retail job she hated and lived in a house that felt more every day like it belonged entirely to her sister's memory of their father. She told herself, standing in that storeroom doorway, that what she was about to do was for Ruby's own good. That Preston Vance represented security, stability, and end to the family's endless financial anxiety, and that Owen, whoever he actually turned out to be beneath the homeless disguise and the vague promises, represented nothing but more uncertainty dressed up as romance. She told herself a lot of things in the hours that followed that made the choice feel smaller than it actually was. That evening, while Ruby showered, Chloe slipped into her sister's room and found her phone charging on the nightstand. She held it for a long moment, thumb hovering some small remaining hesitation flickering, and then dying under the weight of years of quiet resentment. She unplugged the phone, carried it into the bathroom she shared with Ruby, and dropped it directly into the sink full of water she'd already run for the purpose, watching the screen flicker once, twice, and go dark for good. Chloe, have you seen my phone? Ruby called from her room 20 minutes later, patting down the pockets of yesterday's jeans, checking under the bed, growing increasingly frantic as the search turned up nothing. No idea, Chloe said, not looking up from the show, playing on her own phone, her voice carefully flat. Maybe you left it at the diner. Ruby searched the diner the next morning before opening, tore apart her car, retraced every step of the previous day, and found nothing. She filed a claim with her carrier, ordered a replacement that wouldn't arrive for 4 days, and went about her shift with a growing formless unease. She couldn't fully explain the sense of something important slipping out of reach at precisely the moment she needed it most. Across town, Owen waited. He had promised Ruby he would text before coming in each morning, a small habit they'd fallen into over the past week, and when 2 mornings passed without a single response to his messages, worry curdled slowly into some colder. He told himself there could be a dozen innocent explanations. He tried twice calling the diner directly, and both times Chloe answered, her voice carefully bright and unbothered. "Oh hey, yeah, Ruby's actually not around right now," Chloe said the second time, twisting the truth with an ease that startled even her. "She's been really busy lately. With Preston, actually. I probably shouldn't say more than that, but yeah, things have been moving pretty fast." Owen's chest went hollow. "She's with Preston. I mean, I don't want to speak for her," Chloe said, layering just enough false reluctance into her voice to make the lie land harder, "but between us, I think she's finally starting to see the practical side of things. You know how it is. A diner doesn't run on good intentions forever." Owen ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment, the words settling into every old familiar fear he'd carried since he was 9 years old, on a porch in Wheat Ridge. The fear that kindness examined closely enough always turned out to have a price, and that he had once again failed to be worth the exception. Sam found him an hour later, still sitting in the same chair, phone loose in his hand. "She's choosing Preston," Owen said before Sam could ask, his voice flat and hollow. "Her sister told me. Says things have been moving fast." He let out a short, humorless breath. "I should have known. I should have told her the truth the day I found out about her father, instead of hiding behind Sam's caution and my own fear." "Owen." Sam's voice was firm, cutting through the spiral before it could deepen. "I watched that woman tear up a $50,000 check 3 nights ago and give her tip money to a stranger under an overpass. I do not believe for one single second that she has spent the last 2 days falling for Preston Vance because her phone went missing." He crouched down in front of Owen's chair, forcing eye contact. "Something is wrong. This doesn't add up. And I am not going to let one second-hand rumor from her sister undo everything we've spent 2 weeks confirming with our own eyes." Owen looked up slowly, something in Sam's certainty cutting through the fog of old fear just enough to let a sliver of doubt back in. "Then, what do we do?" "We finish what we started," Sam said. "Tomorrow night at the gala, you go in as yourself fully with everything we've documented about the Vance family in hand. And if Ruby really has chosen Preston," Sam's jaw tightened slightly, though his voice didn't waver, "then you'll have your answer in front of everyone, and you'll finally be free of it either way. But Owen, I don't believe that's what you're going to find. I think someone in that house is lying to both of you, and I think we have less than 24 hours to find out who." Owen sat with that for a long moment, the old fear and the new hard-won hope pulling against each other in his chest, before he finally stood something resolute, settling back into his posture. "Tomorrow night, then," he said. "Whatever's waiting for me in that room, I'm not hiding from it anymore." The Brown Palace Hotel had stood at the corner of 17th and Tremont for over a century, its sandstone facade glowing amber under 100 years of Denver's changing skyline, and on the night of the engagement gala, its grand atrium blazed with light crystal chandeliers throwing gold across, marble floors, a string quartet playing softly near the fountain servers, moving through the crowd with trays of champagne that cost more per glass than Ruby Callahan earned in an hour. Ruby stood near the edge of the room in a borrowed dress, her replacement phone finally delivered that afternoon, but still empty of Owen's texts, still carrying nothing but a growing sick dread she couldn't fully name. Diane had insisted on tonight a formal introduction of Ruby to the wider Vance family circle, though Ruby had made it clear repeatedly that she had agreed to nothing beyond attendance. "Smile," Diane murmured beside her, adjusting the collar of Ruby's dress with anxious fingers. "Please, Ruby. Just tonight. Let them see you're grateful for the opportunity." "I'm not grateful," Ruby said quietly. "I'm here because you asked me to be, and because I don't understand why this suddenly matters so much to you." Something flickered across Diane's face, guilt quickly buried, but before Ruby could press further, Preston appeared at her side, resplendent in a tailored tuxedo, steering her gently but firmly toward the center of the room where his father, Richard Vance, stood holding court beside an ice sculpture, bearing the Vance Development logo. "Everyone," Preston announced, raising his glass. "I'd like you to meet someone very special to me." Ruby's stomach turned as dozens of unfamiliar faces turned toward her, polite applause rippling through the crowd. And it was in that exact moment, glass raised, every eye in the room fixed on her, that the grand entrance doors at the far end of the atrium opened. The room's attention shifted as one. Owen Hale walked in wearing a plain charcoal suit, his hair cut as beard, gone 3 weeks of hollow exhaustion, still visible in his face, but standing now with a posture Ruby had never once seen from him, straight back, deliberate, unmistakably a man who belonged in rooms like this one, whether he wanted to or not. Sam Whitfield walked half a step behind him, a leather folder tucked under one arm, his expression carved from granite. A murmur swept the crowd. Someone gasped. A woman near the fountain lifted her phone. Ruby stared, her mind refusing for one long suspended moment to reconcile the man in front of her with the one who had eaten eggs at her counter that morning 3 weeks ago, hollow-cheeked and grateful for a plate of food he couldn't pay for. "Owen," she said so quietly, only Preston, standing close beside her, heard it. Owen crossed the room directly toward her, ignoring the stunned silence rippling outward around him, ignoring Richard Vance's frozen expression, ignoring everyone but the woman standing in the center of it all with confusion and hurt written plainly across her face. "I owe you the truth," Owen said, stopping a few feet from her, his voice steady despite the crowd, despite everything riding on the next several minutes. "All of it. I should have told you weeks ago, and I'm sorry I didn't." "You're Ruby." Shook her head slowly, still struggling to fit the pieces together. "You're Owen Hale." "The Owen Hale? From the news?" "Yes," he said simply. "Founder and chairman of Hale Brewing Company. I built it out of a brewery my father started with nothing, and 3 weeks ago I disguised myself as a homeless man because I needed to know if there was still one person in this city capable of being kind to someone with nothing to offer. In return," his voice caught slightly, but he pushed through it, "I found her the first morning at a diner on 13th and Pearl, and I have spent every day since trying to figure out how to deserve what she gave me before I'd earned a single reason to." A ripple of whispers moved through the crowd. Richard Vance's face had gone rigid, his eyes darting towards Sam and the folder under his arm with the particular alertness of a man who had spent his life learning to sense danger before it fully arrived. "Ruby, I tried to call you," Owen went on. "Text you. For 2 days. Your sister told me you'd chosen Preston, that things were moving fast between you two, and I believed her because some old broken part of me has spent my entire life waiting for exactly that kind of news." Ruby's face drained of color. "My phone's been missing since Tuesday. I never." She turned slowly, searching the crowd until she found Chloe standing near the edge of the room, arms crossed, refusing to meet her sister's eyes. Understanding landed hard and sudden. "Chloe, you told him I was choosing Preston." Chloe said nothing, but the guilt on her face answered clearly enough for the small circle of people close enough to see it. "I never chose anyone," Ruby said, turning back to Owen. Her voice, shaking now, caught somewhere between anger and overwhelming relief. "I didn't even know who you really were. I just knew you were someone worth being kind to." "I know," Owen said softly. "And that's exactly why it had to be you." Preston, recovering some of his composure, stepped forward with a tight, practiced smile. "This is quite the entrance, Mr. Hale, but I'm afraid you're interrupting a private family celebration." "I'm afraid I'm not finished," Owen said, and something in his voice shifted, hardening into the tone Sam recognized from boardrooms, the tone of a man who had already won the argument before anyone else in the room understood one was happening. He glanced at Sam, who stepped forward and opened the folder. 15 years ago, Owen said, his voice carrying now across the suddenly silent atrium, Vance Development paid a man named Roy Tanner $42,000 to disappear from Colorado in exchange for abandoning all custodial claims to a 9-year-old boy he had been abusing for over a year. That boy was me. Your company knew exactly what kind of man Roy Tanner was, and instead of protecting a child, you paid him to vanish quietly so nothing would interfere with your attempt to acquire my father's brewery before it became valuable." A collective gasp swept through the crowd. Richard Vance's face had gone white. "That's a fabrication," Richard said too quickly, his voice cracking slightly under the weight of 100 watching faces. "It's a matter of public record now," Sam said calmly, holding up a copy of the disbursement document for the nearest cluster of onlookers to see. "Filed with the appropriate authorities this afternoon, along with documentation of a predatory balloon mortgage loan your company issued 11 years ago to a small business owner named Frank Callahan, Ruby's father, a loan structured specifically to trap a grieving widower into a debt he could never escape. The color drained further from Richard Vance's face, and most recently Owen continued, his voice steady but sharpening now with something that had been building for 2 weeks. Your family paid Diane Callahan $15,000 to secure an introduction between Ruby and Preston with an additional $35,000 contingent on an actual engagement, a transaction Diane herself has not yet told her daughter about. He turned toward Diane, whose face had gone ashen, and softened his voice slightly, not with cruelty but with something closer to sorrow. I understand you were frightened for your family's future, Mrs. Callahan. I understand that fear better than almost anyone in this room. But you sold Ruby's future to the very family whose predatory loan helped kill her father, and I think somewhere underneath the fear you already knew that. Diane's composure cracked entirely, tears sliding down her face as she looked at Ruby, unable to find words adequate to the moment. 2 uniformed police officers appeared at the edge of the atrium, having been waiting quietly near the hotel's service entrance for the past 20 minutes, and moved now toward Richard and Preston Vance with the calm efficiency of men executing a plan rehearsed well in advance. Richard Vance, Preston Vance, one officer said, "You're both being taken in for questioning regarding financial fraud and predatory lending practices under investigation by the Colorado Attorney General's office." The room erupted into chaos, gasps, murmured, speculation, the sharp flash of phone cameras capturing every second as Preston's practiced charm collapsed entirely into panic denial, his father beside him already reaching for a lawyer's number with shaking hands. Through all of it, Owen turned back to Ruby, the noise of the room fading into something distant and unimportant, and found her staring at him with an expression that held equal parts shock, grief, and something else beginning tentatively to surface underneath both. "I never lied about who I was with you," Owen said quietly, "just for her now. Only about what I owned. Everything I told you at that counter, every word was true." Ruby looked at him for a long moment, the noise of the collapsing Vance empire swirling around them both, and slowly, deliberately reached out and took his hand. "Then tell me the rest," she said. "All of it. I think I've earned that much." The atrium had not fully emptied when the old man appeared. He moved slowly through the dispersing crowd, leaning on a cane that seemed less a necessity than a habit, dressed in a suit a decade out of fashion, his white hair combed carefully despite the late hour. Sam recognized him before Owen did. Gerald Ashford, the attorney who had handled Walter Hale's estate 15 years earlier, a man Owen hadn't laid eyes on since the week of his father's funeral. When a 17-year-old boy in a borrowed black tie had signed papers he barely understood, while a roomful of strangers looked on. "Mr. Hale," Gerald said, stopping in front of Owen, his voice thin with age but steady. "I wondered if I'd live long enough to have this conversation." Owen frowned, still catching his breath from the chaos of the last 20 minutes, Ruby's hand still warm in his. "Mr. Ashford, I didn't know you were here tonight." "I wasn't invited," Gerald said. "I read about the gala in this morning's paper and came anyway. I've been carrying something for 15 years, waiting for the right moment to put it in your hands, and when I saw your name over tonight's headline I decided I'd waited long enough." He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and withdrew a sealed envelope, yellowed slightly at the edges, Owen's name written across the front in handwriting. Owen didn't recognize careful looping, the handwriting of someone who had taken great pains over every letter. "What is this?" Owen asked, his voice suddenly unsteady. "Your father came to my office 6 months before he died," Gerald said. "He'd been searching for your mother quietly for years by then, never telling you because he didn't want to hand you false hope if the search turned up nothing. That spring it finally turned up something, not the answer either of us was hoping for." The room around them had gone strangely hushed, the last of the gala's guests either departed or standing at a respectful distance, sensing without being told that whatever was happening in this small circle mattered more than anything the evening had produced so far. Ruby stood close at Owen's side, saying nothing, simply present, her hand tightening slightly around his. "Your father asked me to keep this sealed until you were ready to receive it," Gerald continued. "He never told me what it said, only that it wasn't his story to tell, it was hers, and it belonged to you alone whenever the day came that you could bear to read it." He held the envelope out. "I think tonight that day has come." Owen's hands trembled as he took it. For a long moment he simply held it, staring down at his own name in a stranger's careful handwriting. His mother's handwriting, he understood, suddenly the same hand that had once written, "You will always be," into the edge of a silver locket before the words ran out. He broke the seal. Inside was a single folded page, and tucked behind it a photocopy of an old police incident report. Its header, partially redacted, dated the same month. Owen had been told his mother abandoned him. He read the letter first. "My darling Owen, if you are ever given this, it means I am gone. And I need you to know something I was never given the chance to tell you myself. I did not leave you. I have never for one single day since that night stopped trying to reach you. Roy caught us on the porch. You remember that much. I think you were only 9, but some things a child's body remembers even when the mind is too young to hold them properly. What you don't know is what happened after he carried you back inside. I did not walk away from that house on my own 2 feet, Owen. I was taken to a hospital 40 miles from Wheat Ridge under a name that was not my own because Roy told the paramedics I had fallen, and there was no one there to say otherwise. I spent 3 weeks trying to recover enough to come back for you. By the time I could stand on my own again, Roy had already told the school the neighbors, and I have to believe, though it breaks something in me even now to write it, told you that I had simply left, that I couldn't handle motherhood, that you weren't worth staying for. None of that was ever true, my love. Not one word of it. I tried 3 times to reach you after that. Twice I was turned away at the door. Once I made it as far as your school, and a man I did not recognize, smooth-spoken, well-dressed, met me in the parking lot before I could reach the front office, and told me very calmly that if I attempted to contact you again there would be consequences neither Roy nor I could afford. He said his employer had already resolved matters with Roy, and had no interest in the story becoming any more complicated than it needed to be. I did not understand then what he meant by employer. I understand it far too well now, lying in this bed running out of time to ever explain any of it to you in person. I do not know what Roy told you about me in all the years since. I only know that whatever it was a lie built to protect grown men's convenience at the expense of a little boy's whole understanding of whether he was loved. You were loved, Owen. You are loved. I have carried that unfinished sentence on that locket in my mind every day, since I had to leave it behind. You will always be the truest, best thing I ever helped bring into this world, and I am so sorry. More sorry than any words on any page could ever hold that I could not finish writing it before everything fell apart. Forgive your father nothing because he did nothing wrong. He searched for me for years, and I hope with everything left in me that this letter finds its way to you through him safely, in a moment when you are ready to hear it. Be well, my darling boy. Be loved. You always were. Mom. Owen's hands had gone completely still by the time he finished reading the paper, trembling not from his grip, but from something deeper, something shaking loose in his chest after 15 years locked rigidly in place. The police report behind the letter told the rest in flat clinical language. An assault, a hospital admission under an assumed name, a case quietly closed. Months later, when the injured party could not be located for follow-up, her trail going cold around the same time a payment of $42,000 had cleared from an account belonging to Vance Development. She died 2 years after writing this, Gerald said gently. Complications from the original injury compounded by years without proper follow-up care. She left this letter with a hospital chaplain, along with your father's name, asking that it eventually find its way to him. It took your father 4 years to track down the chaplain. By the time he had this letter in his hands, he had less than 6 months left to live himself, and he could never bring himself to give it to you. He told me once he was terrified it would break something in you. He wouldn't be alive to help put back together. The sound that came out of Owen then was not a word. It was something older than words. Something that had been sealed inside a 9-year-old boy on a porch in Wheat Ridge for 22 years, and had finally impossibly found a way out. His knees gave slightly and Sam moved to catch him, but it was Ruby who reached him first, stepping in without hesitation, wrapping both arms around him as he sank down onto the marble steps of the hotel's grand staircase, his whole body shaking with a grief too large to carry standing up. She did not tell him it would be all right. She did not try to explain away 15 years of a lie built by frightened, self-interested men. She simply sat down beside him on the cold marble, wrapped in a borrowed dress in a hotel far grander than anything she had ever imagined, standing in and held on the same way. Owen would understand only later that her father had once fed a hungry stranger, without asking a single question, offering nothing but steady, unconditional presence, in a moment when nothing else could possibly help. I'm not going anywhere, Ruby said quietly against the noise of the emptying room, against the flashing lights outside where the Vances were being led toward a waiting patrol car, against 22 years of a boy believing he had been left behind for not being worth the staying. Whatever you need to feel right now, Owen, you don't have to feel it alone. Not tonight. Not ever again if I have anything to say about it. And for the first time in his entire adult life, sitting on cold marble steps with his mother's unfinished sentence pressed against his chest, and the woman who had fed him with nothing but kindness holding on beside him, Owen Hale let himself believe fully and without reservation that he had always been worth staying for. 3 months passed before Denver saw Owen Hale again in any official capacity, and when it did, the occasion was nothing like the gala at the Brown Palace. There were no ice sculptures this time, no orchestras, no crowds dressed to be photographed. Instead, a modest crowd gathered on a quiet stretch of 13th and Pearl, where a freshly painted sign now hung above the door of a small brick diner. Callahan's still the same faded red letters restored carefully to their original "Huend," because some things Ruby had insisted were not meant to be improved upon, only cared for. Beside the diner's front window, a new plaque had been mounted that morning, small and unassuming, easy to miss unless you already knew to look for it. It read simply, "In honor of Frank Callahan and Marianne Hale for teaching two frightened strangers 15 years and 40 miles apart, the same quiet lesson: give your hand first and ask questions later." Owen stood beside it that morning, dressed not in a tailored suit but in a flannel shirt with his sleeves rolled up, much the way his father used to dress behind the bar of that first small brewhouse in Golden decades earlier. In his hands he held a single bottle from Hale Brewing's newest release, a modest batch, nothing like the scale of their usual production, brewed specifically for this one day and this one purpose. The label read, "Frank and Marianne's Kindness," and beneath the name, in smaller script, a line borrowed directly from a letter that had taken 15 years to reach the person it was written for. "You were loved. You are loved. You always were." Ruby stood beside him, no longer wearing a waitress's apron, but something closer to an owner's quiet pride, watching a small crowd of neighbors and regulars gather for the reopening of a diner that had, in its own small way, quietly changed the course of more than one life, without ever intending to. "You ready?" Owen asked her. "I've been ready my whole life," Ruby said, and together they cut the ribbon strung across the newly repaired front door. What followed in the months after was not the stuff of headlines, though. Headlines had certainly followed. Richard and Preston Vance's fraud trial dominated local news for weeks. The full extent of Vance Development's decades of predatory lending and quiet complicity finally exposed to daylight, dozens of other families coming forward once they understood they hadn't been alone in what had happened to them. Diane Callahan, for her part, spent those same months in a harder, quieter reckoning of her own, not with the law, but with her daughter slowly rebuilding, a trust she had nearly spent for good learning. Gradually, what Ruby had understood instinctively, since childhood, that a family's worth was never something that could be measured in the size of a check. Chloe took longer to find her way back. Guilt has a way of working slower than shame, and it was nearly 2 months before she could bring herself to knock on the door of the diner and ask quietly if there was still a place for her, not as someone waiting to be handed something, but as someone finally willing to work for it. Ruby said yes, the way her father would have said yes, without conditions attached. And Sam, who had spent 17 years standing watch over his oldest friend, who had doubted Ruby and then defended her more fiercely than anyone who had uncovered a truth buried 15 years deep and helped carry it into the light. He came over those same months, something the Callahan family had never quite had before: an uncle of sorts, a steady presence at Sunday dinners, the first to show up with tools when the diner's ancient walk-in cooler finally gave out for good. Standing at the counter that reopening morning, watching Ruby laugh with an old regular over a plate of eggs, watching Sam argue good-naturedly with Chloe about the correct way to load a dishwasher, Owen understood something he hadn't fully grasped, even in the rawest moment of grief, on those marble steps 3 months earlier. Healing, it turned out, was rarely a single dramatic moment. It was this ordinary morning's repaired roofs, a family slowly and imperfectly learning to trust each other again, one plate of eggs at a time. That evening, once the diner had closed and the crowd had gone home, Owen and Ruby sat together on the diner's back steps, the same steps where 15 years earlier, and unknown to either of them at the time, a hungry teenage boy had once eaten dinner alone in the dark, grateful, simply not to be turned away. Owen reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew the silver locket, the chain replaced now with fine new links, the cord long since retired. He held it out to Ruby. "I want you to have this," he said. "Not because I'm ready to let go of her. I don't think I'll ever be entirely ready for that, but because I think she'd want it to belong to someone who understands exactly what it means to give without expecting anything back." Ruby took it carefully, turning it over in her palm, reading the familiar unfinished inscription along its edge. "You will always be," the sentence that had haunted Owen for 22 years, cut short by violence and lies, and the careless cruelty of powerful men protecting their own comfort. "It's not finished," she said softly. "I know," Owen said. And then quietly in his own voice he finished it, Not with words engraved in silver, but with words spoken plainly under an ordinary Denver sky to the one person who had proven breakfast by breakfast that the sentence had always been true. You will always be the reason I stopped being afraid to hope again. Ruby didn't say anything. She didn't need to. She simply leaned her head against his shoulder, and together they sat in the quiet watching the last gold light of the day fade behind the mountains. Two people who had each learned in their own hard way that the truest wealth a person could ever hold had nothing to do with the number in a bank account and everything to do with who chose to stay. If there's one thing this story leaves behind, it's a simple truth too easy to forget in a world that measures people by what they own rather than who they are. Kindness given without expectation is never wasted, even when it takes 15 years, or 22, or a lifetime to find its way back to where it belongs. Owen spent his whole life believing he had to build something enormous to prove he was worth loving, when the truth had been sitting quietly behind a diner counter the entire time. Worth isn't something you earn through money or power. It's something you already carry, and it only takes one person willing to see it in you. And Ruby's story reminds us of something just as important, that giving your hand to someone who has nothing to offer back is never really a loss. Sometimes it's the beginning of the very thing you didn't know you were still waiting for. So here's a question for you watching this tonight. What lesson did you take from Owen and Ruby's story? Was it about the danger of judging people by their circumstances? About the quiet power of a single act of kindness rippling forward through 15 years and 2 generations? About what it really means to heal? Drop a comment below and let us know what stayed with you. We read every single one. And this story belongs to all of us who've ever needed someone to give us their hand first and ask questions later. If this story moved you even a little, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness still matters. Leave a comment with your thoughts and subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you again in the next video.